She humiliated me at a party. 2 days later, she was at a job interview, unaware I lead the company. People imagine power as something loud. They picture raised voices in boardrooms, headlines written in bold letters, men who arrive late and leave early just to remind everyone that their time matters more than anyone else's. But real power, true power, rarely announces itself. It watches. It waits. It chooses silence when noise would be easier. That was the version of power I had grown into long before that night. Before we dive deeper, please take some time and like this video. Also subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. We will be excited to have you join our growing community. By the time Daniel called me, I had already chaired meetings that decided the future of companies most people recognized instantly. I had already signed documents that moved numbers large enough to make people dizzy. And I had already learned that the more influence you accumulate, the smaller your circle becomes. The phone rang just after sunset. I was still in my office, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, reviewing reports I didn't need to read anymore but still chose to. Because habits are hard to break when you've built yourself from discipline rather than entitlement. "Ethan," Daniel said, his voice relaxed, familiar, carrying the ease of someone who had known me before the world learned my name. "What are you doing tonight?" I smiled faintly, already knowing where this was headed. "Working," I replied, "like always." There was a pause on the line, followed by a soft chuckle. "You need to stop pretending you enjoy being married to spreadsheets," he said. "There's a private gathering tonight. Investors, founders, a few old names, a few new ones." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "I don't enjoy rooms where people compete without saying it out loud," I said calmly. "That's exactly why you should come," Daniel replied. "No speeches, no stages, no titles, just conversations." I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because I had learned to respect intuition, and something about that invitation felt unnecessary. "Daniel," I said slowly, "you know I don't move in those circles unless there's a reason." There was a brief silence before he answered, more seriously this time. "Come as yourself," he said. "Not as who they think you are, no introductions, no announcements, just be there." I closed my eyes. That was always the dangerous part, because when people don't know who you are, they tell you exactly who they are. "Fine," I said finally, "I'll stop by." "Good," he replied. "Just don't disappear after 10 minutes like you always do." I smiled to myself. No promises. When the call ended, I stood by the window again, watching the city soften as night settled in, thinking about how strange life becomes when you reach a place you once dreamed of and discover that it doesn't change who people are. It only reveals them faster. I didn't dress for the occasion. No tailored statement piece. No watch worth a small house. No effort to impress. I chose a simple shirt, clean shoes, a jacket that had seen better days, and a car that blended into traffic without demanding attention. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I didn't. As I drove to the venue, I remembered something my father once told me, years before he handed me the company that would become the foundation of everything I owned. "Son," he said, standing beside me in a factory that smelled of metal and sweat, "if you ever need to look powerful, you already lost something." That sentence stayed with me. It stayed with me as I handed my keys to the valet. It stayed with me as I stepped into the softly lit hall filled with quiet laughter, polished smiles, and conversations that sounded warm but felt transactional. And it stayed with me as I realized, standing there unnoticed, unremarkable, unintroduced, that tonight I wasn't walking into a party. I was walking into a test. I just didn't know yet who was being tested. The room had settled into its rhythm by the time she arrived. Not silence, never silence, but that curated hum of polite ambition. Glasses clinking softly, restrained laughter floating just a second longer than sincerity required, conversations drifting between markets, travel, and achievements no one openly admitted they were proud of. I was standing near the edge of the room, speaking quietly with Daniel and two other acquaintances. None of us performing, none of us competing, just exchanging words the way men do when they have nothing left to prove. "That deal in Frankfurt closed faster than expected," one of them said, adjusting his cufflinks. Daniel nodded. Timing was right, people underestimate patience. I smiled faintly. Patience is just ambition that learned to breathe. They laughed, not loudly, not for attention, but with recognition. That was when the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. But something shifted, the way it does when attention suddenly leans in one direction without being told to. The music grew louder. Or maybe people just noticed it again. Then heels clicked against marble. Sharp, deliberate, unapologetic. Daniel leaned closer to me and murmured, "Here we go." I turned. Vanessa entered like the room had been waiting for her permission to exist. Designer dress, tight enough to demand stares, flowing enough to suggest effortlessness. Hair sculpted, makeup flawless, posture trained to occupy space rather than request it. She wasn't just dressed to be admired. She was dressed to be validated. She scanned the room as she walked, not searching for people, but for reactions. When she found them, she smiled. Satisfied. A man near the entrance whispered something to his companion. A woman glanced, then glanced again. Vanessa noticed everything. She always did. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's Vanessa. I nodded without asking. I already knew. She moved through the crowd like someone who had learned early that attention could substitute for respect, stopping occasionally to hug someone just long enough for others to notice, laughing louder than the joke required, touching arms, tilting her head when she spoke, performing connection without intimacy. At one point, she lifted her glass and called out, "To success!" her voice ringing just a little higher than necessary. Several people echoed it, not because it meant something, but because she expected them to. She danced briefly near the center of the room, not wild, not free, calculated, elegant, choreographed to remind everyone she was there. And then, inevitably, she moved closer to where we stood. I watched her approach the way one watches a storm on the horizon, aware, calm, unconcerned. She didn't see me at first. Or maybe she did, and decided I didn't qualify. She brushed past Daniel slightly, laughing as she leaned into someone else, her glass tilting dangerously as she gestured too broadly. That's when it happened. The collision was small. Almost nothing. Her elbow nudged my shoulder. The red wine sloshed and spilled down the front of my shirt. The music kept playing. The room kept breathing. For a brief moment, everything paused. I looked down at the stain, then back up at her. Vanessa froze. Her eyes flicked from the spill, to my face, to my clothes. Not apology. Assessment. I smiled politely. It's fine, I said calmly. Accidents happen. For half a second, she looked surprised. Then annoyed. She straightened, lifted her chin, and said, loud enough for people nearby to hear, "Well, maybe if you dressed like you belonged here, people would notice you." Daniel stiffened beside me. I felt him inhale sharply. I raised a hand slightly, not to stop her but to reassure him. Vanessa continued. "I mean honestly," she said, waving her glass vaguely at my shirt, "this is a high-level event, not whatever this is." I met her gaze. Not challengingly. Not defensively. Just steadily. "I wasn't aware clothing determined belonging," I said evenly. Her lips curled. "Oh, trust me," she replied, leaning closer, her voice sharp with practiced condescension. "It absolutely does." People nearby had gone quiet. Not silent, but attentive. Vanessa loved this part, the moment when an audience forms. She looked me up and down again and laughed lightly. "You're lucky it was just wine," she said. "Some places would be asked you to leave." Daniel spoke up then, his voice measured but firm. "That's unnecessary." Vanessa turned to him slowly. "And you are?" she asked. "A friend," he replied. She smirked. "Then you should advise your friend better." I nodded slightly and said, "I appreciate the concern." That seemed to irritate her more. She wanted defensiveness. Anger. Embarrassment. She wanted me to shrink. Instead, I reached for a napkin, dabbed the stain calmly, and said, "Enjoy the party." I turned away. That's when she laughed. Not at a joke. At me. "People like you," she said loudly, "always want to pretend they're above things they could never afford." I stopped, slowly turned back, and smiled again. "Good night," I said. The room exhaled. Vanessa scoffed, already losing interest, already scanning for someone more reactive. She didn't know it yet. But that moment, the wine, the laughter, the judgment, had just placed her directly in the path of consequences she couldn't imagine. And the night was only beginning. The party ended the way most performances do, not with applause but with exhaustion. By the time I decided to leave, the music had softened into background noise, conversations had thinned into rehearsed goodbyes, and the room smelled faintly of perfume, wine, and ambition that had overstayed its welcome. Daniel walked beside me as we headed toward the exit. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said quietly, adjusting his jacket. I shrugged lightly. "People reveal more about themselves when you don't interrupt them." He nodded. "Still, she crossed a line." "She crossed several," I replied calmly, pressing the elevator button. "But lines only matter when someone's afraid to step back." The elevator descended in silence. When the doors opened into the underground parking garage, the air changed instantly. Cooler, emptier, stripped of music and witnesses. The sound of heels echoed sharply behind us. Fast. Angry. Uncontrolled. "Hey." Daniel stopped. "I didn't." "Hey," she repeated louder now, her voice ricocheting off concrete pillars. I turned slowly. Vanessa stood a few steps away, her posture rigid, one hand clenched around her clutch, the other gesturing wildly as though the injustice of my existence had followed her outside. "You think you can just walk away?" she snapped. Daniel stepped forward. "This is unnecessary." She ignored him completely, her eyes locked on me. "I don't know who you think you are," she continued, taking another step closer, "but people like you don't belong in rooms like that." I looked at her, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a calm curiosity that seemed to frustrate her even more. "Belonging," I said evenly, "isn't something anyone else gets to assign." She laughed sharply, shaking her head. "Listen to him," she scoffed, glancing briefly at Daniel as if seeking an audience. "He thinks he's deep." Her laugh faded when neither of us joined. She exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across her face. "You know what your problem is," she said, pointing a manicured finger toward my chest. "You walk around pretending dignity can replace money." I tilted my head slightly. "And you walk around pretending money can replace dignity." Her eyes narrowed. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she smiled. But it wasn't warmth. It was calculation. "Oh," she said slowly, stepping closer again, invading my personal space. "Don't get it twisted. I have money." Daniel folded his arms. "That doesn't excuse." "I wasn't talking to you," she snapped without looking at him. She turned back to me. "You know how many men like you I've seen?" she continued, pacing now, heels clicking sharply with every step. "Always hanging around successful people, hoping some of it rubs off." I didn't respond. That silence did something to her. It emboldened her. She reached out suddenly, tapped the wine-stained part of my shirt with one finger and laughed. "Honestly," she said, shaking her head, "this is embarrassing. I don't even know how you got invited." I smiled faintly. I was asked. "By who?" she demanded. I paused deliberately. "Someone who doesn't confuse volume with value." Her face flushed. That's when she lost control. She spun around sharply, scanning the garage as if searching for something, anything to regain dominance. Then she saw it. A waitress exiting through a service door, holding a tray with a single untouched glass of red wine. Vanessa snapped her fingers. "You," she barked. The waitress hesitated. Vanessa strode over, plucked the glass from the tray without asking, and turned back toward me. Daniel stiffened. "Don't." She didn't listen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She lifted the glass and splashed it directly across my chest. The wine soaked through my shirt, dripped onto the concrete. The sound echoed. The garage fell silent. Vanessa exhaled sharply, almost relieved. "There," she said coldly, Now you look like you belong outside." Daniel took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "That's assault." She laughed. "Oh, please, it's wine, not a weapon." I looked down at myself, then back at her. Slowly, carefully. "You've said enough," I said quietly. She crossed her arms, tilting her head defiantly. "No," she replied, "I haven't." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering but no less venomous. "You're a nobody," she said, "and people like you should know their place." I met her gaze, held it, and then I nodded. "Good night, Vanessa," I said calmly. She blinked. Just once. The sound of her name, spoken without introduction, without explanation, hit her harder than anything else that night. "How do you know my—" I turned away before she could finish. Daniel followed. Behind us, her heels stopped clicking. Her voice didn't follow. The silence stretched, and in that silence, something unfamiliar settled over her. Not anger, not triumph, but uncertainty. She didn't know it yet. But 2 days later, she would walk into one of my companies believing she was there for a fresh start. And she would realize, too late, that the man she humiliated had been sitting at the top the entire time. Vanessa didn't sleep that night. She lay on her bed long after the party lights had gone out, long after the city outside her window had quieted into distant sirens and passing cars, staring at the ceiling as if it might argue back, replaying the parking lot scene again and again, except in her version, she was sharper, wittier, more victorious. And the man in the stained shirt looked smaller than he had in real life. But memory doesn't bend for pride. It only repeats. And every time the scene restarted, something felt off. Not guilt, not regret, just a strange irritation she couldn't name. Vanessa rolled onto her side, reached for her phone, and scrolled mindlessly, the blue glow reflecting off her perfectly manicured nails, her mind drifting backward without permission, to a time long before designer dresses and curated confidence. Before mirrors became weapons. She hadn't grown up wealthy. That was the part she never mentioned. Her childhood apartment was small, narrow, always smelling faintly of reheated food and old furniture polish. The kind of place where walls were thin and dreams had to be whispered so they wouldn't echo back sounding foolish. Her mother used to say, "We'll be fine, Ness, just keep your head down." Vanessa hated that phrase. Keep your head down. It sounded like surrender. At school, she learned early how hierarchy worked. The girls with the best shoes were listened to. The boys whose parents drove luxury cars were respected. Teachers smiled differently at students who didn't need scholarships. So Vanessa adapted. She learned to speak louder, laugh sharper, dress better than her circumstances allowed. When she couldn't afford something, she learned to imitate it. When she felt invisible, she learned to dominate conversations. And when people looked down on her, she learned to look down first. By the time she left home, she had made herself a promise. No one would ever mistake her for small again. Her climb wasn't easy. The city didn't hand her opportunities out of kindness. She waited tables by day, attended networking events by night, smiled through exhaustion, memorized names she didn't care about, and learned quickly which compliments opened doors and which silences closed them. She dated men she didn't love because they had access. She dropped friends who reminded her too much of where she came from. And when she finally landed her first serious role at a mid-sized firm, she told herself it was proof that the world had finally recognized her. But recognition, she discovered, was addictive. Each promotion didn't satisfy her, it raised the threshold. Each upgrade made the last one feel embarrassing. Soon enough became an insult. By the time she was 30, Vanessa had built an image so carefully that she no longer knew where it ended, and she began. Confidence had become armor. Cruelty had become reflex. And humility felt like a threat. Back in her apartment that night, she sat up abruptly, throwing the covers aside, walking toward the mirror as if it might reassure her. She stared at her reflection. Perfect hair, perfect skin, perfect posture, Yet something in her eyes flickered. She remembered the man at the party. Not his clothes, not his silence, but the way he hadn't flinched. The way he hadn't begged, explained, or defended himself. Men like that unsettled her. Because they didn't need permission. She shook her head, scoffing softly at herself. "Get a grip," she muttered aloud. She turned away from the mirror, grabbed her planner from the desk, and flipped it open with determination. 2 days later. Final interview. Chairman present. Her lips curved into a confident smile. "This is it," she whispered, her voice steady again. "This is where everything changes." She didn't know yet that the man she had soaked in red wine was the same man whose signature decided futures. She didn't know that confidence without competence collapses under scrutiny. And she certainly didn't know that the meeting she believed would save her life would instead confront her with every version of herself she had tried to outrun. Vanessa closed the planner, turned off the light, and slept finally, believing the world still owed her something. It didn't. The morning of the interview arrived dressed in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense, anticipatory stillness that settles over people who believe everything they've worked for is about to be decided in a single room. Vanessa woke before her alarm. She sat on the edge of her bed, elbows resting on her knees, fingers interlocked so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, whispering affirmations under her breath as though repetition alone could bend reality. "You belong in that room," she murmured. "You've earned this. This is your moment." She dressed carefully. Not extravagantly, she had learned that lesson, but expensively enough to signal authority, choosing a tailored blazer, understated heels, and a watch that had cost more than her first year's rent when she was younger, adjusting it twice in the mirror as if alignment could substitute for calm. By the time she arrived at the corporate tower, the lobby was already alive with quiet competition. Candidates sat spaced apart, some rehearsing answers in their heads, others pretending not to care. All of them glancing occasionally at the elevator doors like gamblers watching spinning wheels. Vanessa checked in at the front desk and took her seat, crossing her legs with deliberate confidence. That was when she spotted him. A familiar face. One of the junior panel members from the earlier rounds, Mark Reynolds. Her jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. She rose smoothly and walked over, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Mark," she said warmly, placing a hand lightly on his arm, "I didn't realize you'd be here today." He looked up surprised, then smiled, nervous, almost relieved. "Vanessa, yes, a final stage," he said. She tilted her head, lowering her voice. "I've been meaning to thank you," she added gently, her eyes holding his just long enough. "You really understood my vision in the earlier interview." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the panels." "I know," she interrupted softly, smiling, "but it helps when someone sees potential beyond paperwork." A pause. Then she added casually, "If there's anything I can clarify later today, I'd be happy to." She squeezed his arm once. Just enough. And returned to her seat. I watched all of this from the upper floor. Not through cameras. Through patterns. I had learned long ago that people reveal more in waiting rooms than they ever do in boardrooms. When my assistant entered my office, tablet in hand, her expression was measured. "Sir," she said, "there's something you should be aware of." I looked up. One of the candidates scheduled for the final interview performed below average in the first 2 rounds, she continued, tapping the screen. "But she's been advanced anyway." I leaned back slowly. "Who authorized that?" She hesitated. "Unofficially, one of the panel members." I nodded once. "Add her to my schedule." Vanessa's name was called shortly after. She entered the interview room with her shoulders back, chin lifted, her confidence returning now that she was back on familiar ground, talking, presenting, performing. But confidence, I've learned, only works when it's supported by clarity. The first question came from the finance director. "Can you walk us through how you would assess risk in a volatile market without compromising growth?" Vanessa smiled, inhaled, and began speaking. Her words flowed quickly. Too quickly. She spoke about innovation, resilience, adaptability. But when asked for specifics, she circled back to abstractions, repeating phrases without anchoring them to data or experience. The director leaned forward. Could you give us a concrete example? Vanessa hesitated. Well, in my previous role, I often. What role was that? Another panelist interjected. She paused. I oversaw strategy. Strategy for what? He pressed. The room grew quieter. Her answers began to unravel. Not dramatically. Subtly. Like a thread pulled too gently to notice, until the fabric weakens. Then I entered. The atmosphere shifted. Not because of my title, but because silence recognizes authority before introductions do. Vanessa looked up. Her breath caught, just for a fraction of a second. Enough. Our eyes met. Recognition flickered. Confusion followed. Then fear. She recovered quickly, credit where it's due, but something fundamental had changed. I took my seat at the head of the table, folded my hands, and spoke calmly. Ms. Vanessa, I said evenly, do you recall a conversation we had recently? She swallowed. No, sir. I nodded. Interesting, I replied, because I remember it quite clearly. The panel exchanged glances. I continued. At a private event, you made several assumptions about a stranger's worth based on his appearance. I'm curious, do you believe that's a reliable way to assess people in business? Her lips parted. I know, sir, that was a misunderstanding. I tilted my head slightly. Then help us understand something else, I said. Your earlier interview scores were among the lowest we recorded this quarter. Can you explain why you believe you were advanced? She opened her mouth, closed it, looked briefly toward Mark. He avoided her eyes. The silence stretched. Finally she spoke, her voice softer now, stripped of its polish. I believe I deserve a chance. I leaned forward. So does everyone who prepared honestly, I replied. But this company doesn't operate on chances, it operates on competence. Her composure cracked. She stood abruptly, then stopped herself, hands trembling slightly as she pressed them against the table. Please, she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts. This job would change everything for me. I stood as well. Ms. Vanessa, I said quietly, your skills can be developed, your attitude cannot be ignored. I turned to the panel. This interview is concluded. Vanessa's knees buckled. She didn't fall dramatically, just sank back into her chair, stunned. As she was escorted out, her eyes met mine one last time. Not with anger, not with arrogance, but with understanding. The kind that arrives too late. And as the doors closed behind her, I realized something I had learned long ago and hoped she would one day understand. Life rarely punishes people for being poor, but it always exposes those who confuse dignity with display. Vanessa didn't remember how she left the building. Later, when she tried to replay the moment in her mind, it arrived in fragments instead of a sequence. The cold touch of the marble floor beneath her palms as she steadied herself, the polite but distant voice of the HR representative saying, "We'll walk you out." The soft chime of the elevator doors closing like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. Outside, the city moved on without her. Cars glided past, horns sounded, people laughed into their phones, and somewhere above her, meetings continued, deals were discussed, futures were shaped, none of them waiting for a woman who had just lost what she believed was her last chance. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Long enough for the confidence she had worn that morning to finally slip off her shoulders and fall to the ground. Her phone vibrated in her hand. Once, twice, she didn't answer. She already knew what it would be. Questions she couldn't answer, reassurances she didn't believe, invitations she no longer deserved. When she finally began walking, it wasn't toward home. It was toward a small cafe across the street, the kind she would have ignored before, too modest, too ordinary, too invisible for someone who believed she was meant for grander rooms. She sat by the window and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. As she waited, her reflection stared back at her in the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't like what she saw. Not because she looked tired, but because she recognized herself. The hunger, the insecurity, the anger she had disguised as ambition. The way she had learned to strike first so no one could look down on her. Her mind drifted backward, uninvited but relentless. She remembered sleeping on a borrowed couch years ago, promising herself she would never be small again, never be ignored, never be the person people dismissed with a shrug. She remembered her first paycheck, how it felt like proof that she mattered. And somewhere along the way, she realized, she had started believing that respect came from intimidation, that power came from humiliation, that if she spoke loudly enough, no one would hear the fear underneath. The stranger at the party, the man in simple clothes, the one she had splashed with wine, laughed at, reduced to nothing because she thought nothing was all he could be. Her chest tightened. If I had just apologized, she thought. If I had just been kind. But life, she now understood, doesn't undo moments. It only teaches through them. 2 weeks later, the headline appeared everywhere. Low-profile chairman leads stunning corporate expansion. She stared at the article for a long time. At the photograph. At the familiar eyes. At the calm expression of a man who had never needed to announce himself. Her phone slipped from her hand onto the table. So that was the cost, she realized. Not losing the job. Not losing the opportunity. But losing the version of herself she had convinced the world she was. That night, Vanessa walked home alone. And for the first time, she didn't rehearse explanations, didn't draft excuses, didn't blame fate or unfair systems or cruel timing. She sat in the quiet and let the truth sit with her. That power without humility is noise. That confidence without character is hollow. That some doors don't close because you weren't good enough. They close because you forgot how to be human. And somewhere across the city, in a life she would never again intersect with, I returned to my work, unchanged, unbothered, certain of one thing. Success reveals people, but failure teaches them. And whether Vanessa would learn that lesson or repeat the same mistakes in another room, another city, another life. That part of the story was no longer mine to tell. If you found this story interesting, please remember to like this video and hit the subscribe button. Also turn on the notification so you don't miss out on any of our amazing videos. And lastly, endeavor to share this video with your friends. Thank you and see you in the next video.